We called to them, tried to tell them there was no danger, called them to stop, implored them to stand. We called them cowards, denounced them in the most offensive terms, put our heavy revolvers and threatened to shoot them, but all in vain. A cruel, crazy, mad, hopeless panic possessed them and communicated to everybody about in the front and rear. The heat was awful. Although now about 6, the men were exhausted, their mouths gaped, their lips cracked and blackened with the powder of the cartridges they had bitten off in battle, their eyes starting in a frenzy. No mortal ever saw such a mass of ghastly wretches.
Thus reported Ohio Congressman Albert Riddle after witnessing the rout of Union forces at the First Battle of Bull Run, July 21st, 1861. This first major conflict of the war went badly for the North, shaking the confidence of Northern leaders as it strengthened the resolve of those in the South. After the fall of Fort Sumter 3 months earlier, tens of thousands of men answered Lincoln's call for 90-day enlistments to defend the nation from internal threat. But by mid-July 1861, their enlistments were nearly expired, and these men were looking to go home. President Lincoln felt the pressure of those coming expirations, not to mention the growing number of Confederate troops on the other side of the Potomac from Washington, D.C. Even more, the public was demanding action. Editorials in Northern papers clamored for General-in-Chief Winfield Scott to strike for the capital of the Confederacy. "On to Richmond," they cried. Lincoln hoped a more limited attack at the Confederate forces gathered in Manassas, Virginia, would be able to accomplish what he wanted most, a quick end to the insurrection, without doing irreparable harm to the South. And so, Brigadier General Irvin McDowell was sent to lead his unseasoned troops into battle with P.T. Beauregard's equally unseasoned Confederate troops near the vital rail junction in Manassas. "You are green, it is true," Lincoln told McDowell, "but they are green also." But a series of problems for the North resulted in the Green Confederates under Beauregard, assisted by troops under General Joseph E. Johnston, whipping the short-timers under McDowell. An orderly retreat turned into a panicked rout as Union troops threw aside their guns and equipment in desperation. The Union suffered almost 500 dead and 2,500 wounded, captured, or missing. In comparison, the Confederate troops lost almost 400 dead, 1,600 wounded, and a handful missing. To those in the North who had expected an easy victory, defeat came as a shock. New York attorney George Templeton Strong wrote in his diary,
"Today will be known as Black Monday. We are utterly and disgracefully routed, beaten, whipped by secessionists."
The First Battle of Bull Run, or the First Battle of Manassas, as it was called by the Confederates, had long-reaching effects. Beauregard was promoted for his actions that day, and Brigadier General Thomas Jackson earned his famous nickname, Stonewall. Meanwhile, McDowell was soon replaced by Major General George B. McClellan as commander of the Army of the Potomac. Though much smaller than some battles that would occur later in the war, at the time, Bull Run was the largest battle in American history. The Confederate victory in this fight led many in the South to think that they had all but won the war. But despite the sense of humiliation and despair among many in the North, the defeat at Manassas actually served to strengthen Union forces. General Benjamin Butler recognized this in a letter to Montgomery Blair, the Postmaster General.
We have heard the sad news from Manassas, but are neither dismayed nor disheartened. It will have the good effect to teach us wherein we are weak and they are strong, and how to apply the remedy to our deficiencies.
Lincoln seemed to see the same lesson in the defeat. The day after the rout at Bull Run, Lincoln signed a bill calling for the enlistment of 500,000 volunteers, these to serve 3 years rather than 3 months. Just 3 days later, he signed a bill raising that to 1 million. Many of these men would form the Army of the Potomac. Over the next 2 months, McClellan would take these raw, undisciplined troops and train them into a fine army. By October, he had 120,000 men in his army. By November, 168,000. Along the way, he would build near impregnable fortifications around the city of Washington. Scores of forts and hundreds of big guns defended the capital from Confederate forces just across the Potomac. But the war did not wait for McClellan to ready his forces. To the west, Missouri was in the middle of its own internal civil war, with Unionist and secessionist guerrilla bands fighting back and forth for control of the state. Just after Bull Run, General John C. Fremont arrived in Missouri to take command of the Western Department. He found himself in the middle of a bloody struggle between groups who had been trading shots for months. About a month before the assault on Fort Sumter, the Missouri Constitutional Convention voted 98-1 that the state would remain in the Union, but would not contribute arms or men to either side if war broke out. But a week after Sumter, a secessionist mob overran the arsenal in Liberty, Missouri, making off with 1,000 rifles and muskets. Union commanders were right to be concerned. Despite Missouri's official position, Governor Claiborne Jackson was working with Confederate President Jefferson Davis to arrange bringing Missouri into the Confederacy. The Confederates smuggled a shipment of artillery to Jackson, who in turn moved it to a military encampment a few miles out from St. Louis. On May 9th, the howitzers, siege guns, and 500 muskets arrived in the camp. Jackson had organized a pro-secession militia to practice maneuvers there, and they were now ready to move on the arsenal. Governor Jackson was able to get the legislature to approve a new Missouri State Guard, led by Major General Sterling Price. The Guard's purpose was to resist invasion by federal troops and to squash rebellion. Rebellion, in this case, meant Missourians who had joined the Union forces. Nathaniel Lyon was promoted to Brigadier General and put in charge of Union forces in Missouri. On June 11th, 1861, he met with Governor Jackson to negotiate a treaty between their two sides. That proved impossible. Over the next few weeks, the two sides fought a series of skirmishes. Meanwhile, the Missouri Constitutional Convention appointed a new governor, Hamilton Rowan Gamble, a man loyal to the Union. Then, on August 10th, at the Battle of Wilson's Creek, Union forces suffered a significant defeat. General Lyon and his force of about 6,000 men were camped in Springfield. Approaching them were 12,000 men from the combined forces of the Missouri State Guard, Arkansas Militia, and Confederate regulars under Brigadier General Benjamin McCulloch. Lyon planned to hit the Confederates in surprise attack, then withdraw to seek reinforcements and supplies. So, at 5 a.m. on the 10th, he split his force in two, planning to strike the larger Confederate force in a pincer movement. But in the confusion of the battle, the two Union forces were unable to communicate and coordinate movement. General Lyon was killed in the battle, and Major Samuel Sturgis was forced to lead the Union troops in an organized retreat. With the loss at Wilson's Creek, the Union lost control of southwest Missouri. General John C. Fremont, the new commander in the West, had to find a way to turn things around. Militarily, he failed to do so. Secessionist guerrillas roamed across the state. The Confederate troops under Sterling Price moved north, and by September 20th, they had captured the city of Lexington as well. In August, Fremont tried a completely different approach. He declared martial law in Missouri. Any Confederate guerrillas would face the death penalty, and all slaves belonging to Confederates would be freed. This order outraged the border states, which Lincoln was struggling to maintain within the Union. In the early stages of the war, relatively few Northerners saw their goal as freeing the slaves. The Northern armies fought to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. But individuals, such as Fremont, took steps early on that moved the Union closer to emancipation. General Benjamin Butler in Virginia, May 1861, made the decision that he would not return fugitive slaves to their Southern masters. Those states, he argued, could not secede from the Union and then demand that their rights to human property under the fugitive slave law be protected by the federal government. Butler declared that these slaves were contraband of war and put them to work for the Union forces. He did not arm them, but every job completed by a contraband freed a white soldier to fight. And within a few months, he had almost 1,000 contrabands. Harriet Tubman, the famed conductor of the Underground Railroad, joined General Butler's forces to help organize and care for the contrabands. In August 1861, Congress passed and Lincoln signed the first Confiscation Act, which made this policy official. When Fremont issued his personal Emancipation Proclamation in Missouri, Lincoln directed him to modify it to comport with the Confiscation Act. That is, rather than freeing all slaves belonging to Confederates, Fremont could only declare free those slaves who had been used to support the Confederacy. When Fremont refused to make these changes, Lincoln was forced to overrule the general and remove him from office. This decision helped Lincoln maintain the loyalty of the border states, but drew a harsh reaction from radical Republicans. Frederick Douglass, in particular, had praised Fremont's action and was angered by Lincoln's move.
The weakness and imbecility of the letter of the president condemning that proclamation have thus far characterized the whole war.
But Lincoln believed that people in the North were not ready to make this war about abolishing slavery. What Lincoln and many in the North felt was lacking in this war was actual fighting by those now splendidly trained and equipped troops under McClellan. McClellan had no interest in freeing the slaves. He wrote to influential fellow Democrat Samuel Barlow,
"Help me to dodge the nigger. We want nothing to do with him. I am fighting to preserve the integrity of the Union and the power of the government, and no other issue. To gain that end, we cannot afford to mix up the Negro question. It must be incidental and subsidiary."
McClellan had done an excellent job training the new Army of the Potomac, as well as preparing the defenses of Washington. But he was showing himself to be overcautious as a military commander. Again and again, when pressed by Lincoln for action, he would insist that Confederate forces outnumbered his own. This, despite the fact that in October he had 120,000 men facing just 45,000 Confederates across the Potomac. In October, there was one minor skirmish, but once again, it turned out badly for the Union. Colonel Edward Baker, who was a senator from Oregon and a personal friend of Lincoln's, was attempting to dislodge Confederate forces from Leesburg, Virginia. Instead, he and his men were surrounded by Confederates at a place called Ball's Bluff. Baker was killed in the fighting, and his men were driven back over the edge of the bluff in a panicked rout. As many men died of drowning as of bullet wounds, and hundreds more were captured by the rebels. This debacle did not encourage McClellan into action. As the fall wore on, finally becoming winter, the Army of the Potomac sat. As historian James M. McPherson has noted, McClellan excelled at preparation, but it was never quite complete. The army was perpetually almost ready to move, but the enemy was always larger and better prepared. In early 1862, a fighting general did emerge in the Western theater of the war. General Ulysses S. Grant led assaults on important southern river forts. On February 6th, he led 2 divisions in the capture of the undermanned Fort Henry on the Tennessee River. The fort was taken with minimal losses, and Grant moved quickly overland to assault Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. Grant faced stronger resistance at Donelson, but after a series of attacks and counterattacks between the two sides, by February 16th, Grant's command of the field was so clear that the Confederate commanders, Brigadier General John Floyd and his second in command, Brigadier General Gideon Pillow, panicked. Buckner was an old acquaintance of Grant's, going back to their years at West Point and service in the Army. Perhaps Buckner thought this would mean better terms of surrender for him and his men. If so, he was proven wrong. In response to Buckner's request to discuss terms, Grant sent the following message.
Yours of this date, proposing armistice and appointment of commissioners to settle terms of capitulation, is just received. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works.
Buckner replied that circumstances compelled him to accept Grant's ungenerous and unchivalrous terms. The capture of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson were the first major victories by Union forces, and they were celebrated wildly. Ulysses S. Grant became known throughout the North as Unconditional Surrender Grant. Over 12,000 Confederate soldiers were captured, setting up another, much bloodier Union victory months later at Shiloh. The Battle of Shiloh in southwestern Tennessee, April 6th and 7th, 1862, was very nearly a Union defeat. Grant had developed a reputation for focusing more on his own plans than on the enemy's actions. This contributed to significant losses on April 6th, when his men were encamped at Pittsburgh Landing along the Tennessee River. Grant was criticized later for failing to have his men prepare adequate fortifications at Shiloh. He responded in his memoirs,
Up to that time, the pick and spade had been but little resorted to at the West. Besides this, the troops with me, officers and men, needed discipline and drill more than they did experiences with the pick, shovel, and axe. Reinforcements were arriving almost daily, composed of troops that had been hastily thrown together into companies and regiments, fragments of incomplete organizations, the men and officers strangers to each other. Under all these circumstances, I concluded that the drill and discipline were worth more to our men than fortifications.
Nonetheless, the lack of fortifications made it all the easier for Albert Sidney Johnston and P.T. Beauregard to strike the Union troops in a bloody surprise attack. Grant, nursing an ankle that had been badly injured when his horse had fallen days earlier, had not expected an attack and was miles away in Savannah.
While I was at breakfast, heavy firing was heard in the direction of Pittsburgh Landing, and I hastened there. On reaching the front, about 8 a.m., I found that the attack on Pittsburgh was unmistakable. Captain Baxter, a quartermaster on my staff, was accordingly directed to go back and order General Wallace to march immediately to Pittsburgh by the road nearest the river.
Miscommunications resulted in General Lew Wallace not arriving where and when Grant needed him, and Wallace's troops would not take part in the first day of fighting. The Battle of Shiloh took its name from what Grant called a log meeting house, 2 to 3 miles from the Pittsburgh Landing.
This point was the key to our position and was held by Sherman. His division was at that time wholly raw, no part of it ever having been in an engagement. But I thought this deficiency was more than made up by the superiority of the commander.
Grant's faith in General William Tecumseh Sherman was complete and would remain so throughout the war. In the Battle of Shiloh, Sherman proved himself deserving of Grant's trust. Grant described the first day of battle.
During the whole of Sunday, I was continuously engaged in passing from one part of the field to another, giving directions to division commanders. In thus moving along the lines, however, I never deemed it important to stay long with Sherman. A casualty to Sherman that would have taken him from the field that day would have been a sad one for the troops engaged at Shiloh. And how near we came to this. On the 6th, Sherman was shot twice, once in the hand, once in the shoulder, the ball cutting through his coat and making a slight wound, and a third ball passing through his hat. In addition to this, he had several horses shot during the day. The Confederate assaults were made with such a disregard of losses on their own side that our line of tents soon fell into their hands. The ground on which the battle was fought was undulating, heavily timbered with scattered clearings, the woods giving some protection to the troops on both sides. A number of attempts were made by the enemy to turn our right flank, where Sherman was posted, but every effort was repulsed with heavy loss. But the front attack was kept up so vigorously that, to prevent the success of these attempts to get to our flanks, the National troops were compelled, several times, to take positions to the rear near Pittsburgh Landing. When the firing ceased at night, the National line was all of a mile in rear of the position it had occupied in the morning.
Both sides had taken shockingly high casualties, the highest seen in the war to that point. The Confederates had indeed lost over 8,000 men that first day. Among them was the commander of the Confederate forces. With Johnston's death, General P.T. Beauregard took command. Beauregard sent a telegram that night to President Jefferson Davis. It read, "A complete victory." Unfortunately for him, his assessment was premature. Many later criticized Beauregard for calling a halt to the attack at dusk, feeling that if he had continued to push, then perhaps a complete victory would have been possible. But his men were exhausted, and there was less than an hour of daylight remaining. And Beauregard did not know what was happening in the Union camp. Grant's forces had been reinforced by 15,000 men in Major General Don Carlos Buell's army. And General Lew Wallace's division of 5,000 men were also fresh troops, having not seen major fighting on the first day. With these additional Union forces and the loss of troops on the Confederate side, Beauregard would find himself outnumbered on April 7th, when Grant and Buell counterattacked. Shiloh was a Union victory, but a terribly costly one. Union forces lost over 1,750 killed, 8,400 wounded, and almost 3,000 captured or missing. The numbers on the Confederate side were similar, except for a much smaller number captured or missing. The willingness of the Confederate Army to take such losses worked to change Grant's understanding of how victory could be accomplished.
I saw an open field, in our possession on the second day, of which the Confederates had made repeated charges the day before, so covered with dead that it would have been possible to walk across the clearing in any direction, stepping on dead bodies, without a foot touching the ground. Up to the Battle of Shiloh, I, as well as thousands of other citizens, believed that the rebellion against the government would collapse suddenly and soon if a decisive victory could be gained over any of its armies. Donelson and Henry were such victories. Up to that time, it had been the policy of our army, certainly of that portion commanded by me, to protect the property of the citizens whose territory was invaded, without regard to their sentiments, whether Union or secession. After this, however, I regarded it as humane to both sides to protect the persons of those found at their homes, but to consume everything that could be used to support or supply armies.
Grant took a lot of heat in the North for the Union losses. There were false reports of him being drunk and criticisms of his lack of fortifications. Some wanted him removed from command, to which Lincoln replied famously, "I can't spare this man. He fights." This in contrast to his premier general in the East, George McClellan. Yet McClellan finally was preparing to move. He planned an invasion of Virginia by water, taking his army down the Chesapeake Bay near the mouth of the James River. They would land at Fort Monroe, 70 miles southeast of Richmond, and then move toward the Confederate capital. Whether or not this plan was sound, the execution was problematic. After landing on the Virginia Peninsula, in early April, McClellan and 55,000 troops laid siege to Yorktown. Defending the site were just 13,000 Confederate soldiers, commanded by Major General John Magruder. Though McClellan had an overwhelming numerical superiority, he was convinced that Magruder had far more men. This was aided by Magruder's theatrics, in which he moved men about quickly to create the sense of greater numbers. Though pressed by Lincoln to attack, McClellan dug in and lay siege for a month. During that time, Johnston's forces moved in to support Magruder, and in the end, all of the Confederate forces fell back toward Richmond before McClellan could finally make use of his heavy artillery. A month spent, and almost nothing gained. Battle finally occurred in Williamsburg, where 32,000 Confederates, under Major General James Longstreet, fought a delaying action against 41,000 Union troops under Brigadier General Joseph Hooker. The Union troops were eventually able to push back the Confederates and claim victory, but the fighting in Williamsburg had allowed the bulk of the Confederate forces to reach Richmond in time to defend it against the invading forces. By late May, McClellan's Army of the Potomac had advanced to the outskirts of Richmond. At a little spot just south of the Chickahominy River, known as Seven Pines, his forces would be temporarily halted by the bloodiest battle to date in the Eastern Theater of the war. Confederate General Joseph Johnston developed a complex plan in which 51,000 of his men would strike McClellan's 2nd and 3rd Corps, about 33,000 troops. Implementation of the plan proved difficult, and though the Union advance was slowed, the Confederates took heavy casualties. Both sides claimed victory, though both suffered significant losses. The Union took 5,000 casualties, including almost 800 killed, 3,600 wounded, and over 600 missing or captured. But the Confederates were hit even harder, with almost 1,000 killed and almost 5,000 wounded, plus 400 captured or missing. McClellan spent the next 3 weeks entrenching and regrouping, settling in for a long siege of Richmond. On the Confederate side, General Johnston had been wounded in action, and a new leader of the Southern forces emerged. A man whose aggressive tactics were the precise opposite of McClellan's excessive caution, and who would build a name for himself that would long survive the war and all its participants. A man named Robert E. Lee. While McClellan spent the next weeks preparing to lay siege, Lee spent the time preparing to strike. From June 25th to July 1st, 1862, there was a brutal series of battles outside of Richmond, which brought McClellan's Peninsula campaign to an ignominious end. On the 25th, the Union gained a Pyrrhic victory in the Battle of Oak Grove, where they gained a mere 600 yards of ground at the cost of almost 70 dead and 500 wounded, versus a similar death toll but fewer wounded among the Confederates. This minor battle was the only actual offensive strike against Richmond during the campaign. Over the next several days, Lee's army struck at McClellan repeatedly. In battles at Beaver Dam Creek, Gaines Mill, Garnet and Golding's Farm, Savage's Station, and Glendale, Lee's assaults had limited success in damaging McClellan's forces, but they did succeed in pushing the Army of the Potomac back and back further from Richmond. The final fight occurred on July 1st at the Battle of Malvern Hill. Union forces that day were commanded by Major General Fitz John Porter. Lee had prepared another complex plan of attack, but muddy roads and poor maps prevented the coordinated effort that was required to succeed. General Porter later described the action of that day.
About 10 a.m., the enemy's skirmishers and artillery began feeling us along our line. They kept up a desultory fire until about 12 o'clock, with no severe injury to our infantry, who were well massed and who revealed but little of our strength or position by retaliatory firing or exposure. The spasmodic, though sometimes formidable attacks of our antagonists at different points along our whole front, up to about 4 o'clock, were presumably demonstrations or feelers to ascertain our strength preparatory to their engaging in more serious work. At about 5:30 o'clock, as column after column advanced, only to meet the same disastrous repulse, the sight became one of the most interesting imaginable. The havoc made by the rapidly bursting shells from guns arranged so to sweep any position far or near, and in any direction, was fearful to behold. Pressed to the extreme as they were, the courage of our men were fully tried. The safety of our army, the life of the Union, was felt to be at stake. In one case, the brigades of Howe, Abercrombie, and Palmer of Couch's division, under impulse, gallantly pushed after the retreating foe, captured colors, and advantageously advanced the right of the line, but at considerable loss and great risk. The brigades of Morrill, cool, well-disciplined, and easily controlled, let the enemy return after each repulse, but permitted the few to escape their fire. I sent messages to the commanding general expressing the hope that our withdrawal had ended and that we should hold the ground now occupied, even if we did not assume the offensive. It was now after 9 o'clock at night. I received orders to withdraw and to move at specified hours to Harrison's Landing.
One should never forget that these battles took place on roads, fields, and woods near the homes of civilian families, trying to survive while the world exploded around them. Edward Neal was a chaplain with the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment at the Battle of Malvern Hill. He described one family's experience.
When night came, I slept on a sofa in the West House. The person who seemed to be the head of the household was a gentle, manly man, but greatly worried by the eruption of an invading army trampling down his crops. Before the morning, the 1st of July, Sumner's Corps reached Malvern Hill from Glendale and was posted on the right of the Union Army, About 8 o'clock, Confederate artillery took position in a wheat field on the Poindexter farm and opened fire. The shells bursting near the West House. The family, with some of their neighbors, in consternation fled into the cellar, to which there was access to a large outside door.
The Confederate assault at Malvern Hill failed to gain ground against the Union troops, whose position was nearly impregnable. The rebels never got within 200 yards of the main Union line. Union artillery tore the Confederates apart as wave after wave of rebels continued to attack. Lee's men took over 5,600 casualties, compared with 2,100 for the Army of the Potomac. However, despite achieving victory in the battle, McClellan withdrew to Harrison's Landing on the James River, where his army could be protected by Union gunboats. McClellan informed the president that Richmond could not be taken at this time, and they returned north. Once again, McClellan had failed to deliver the offensive strike that Lincoln was looking for. McClellan himself blamed the failure on delays by Lincoln and Halleck in providing reinforcements, but Lincoln was convinced now that McClellan was not the man he needed to lead the Union attack. On June 26, 1862, President Lincoln reorganized the Union forces, creating the Army of Virginia, not to be confused with Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Lincoln gave the command to Major General John Pope, who had recently been highly successful in the Western Theater of Operations. Lincoln's orders to the Army of Virginia were for it to protect the capital, but also, in the speediest manner, attack and overcome the rebel forces. In other words, Lincoln wanted action. Pope issued a number of orders that indicated that he would take a harder approach against the rebels than McClellan would have considered. His General Order Number 5 directed that his troops be subsisted on the country in which their operations are conducted. In other words, the soldiers should take what they needed, food, supplies, horses, mules, from the citizens of rebel states, a harbinger of things to come under Generals Sheridan and Sherman in 1864. In mid-July, Pope led a force into Culpeper Courthouse. By the end of the month, Pope had over 40,000 men occupying the village. Lee, ever the aggressive fighter, was confident that McClellan would not attack, though he was still camped near Richmond. Lee sent Stonewall Jackson with General A.P. Hill's division to head off Pope in Gordonsville. On August 9th, Union and Confederate forces clashed at the base of Cedar Mountain, 8 miles south of Culpeper. Pope's forces were moving south towards Gordonsville. Jackson hoped to strike at the lead elements under General Banks and defeat them before they could merge again with the rest of the Union force. Jackson was surprised by the force of the attack by Banks' troops, and initially the Confederate general and his men were pushed back. But Jackson was able to rally his men, especially the famous Stonewall Brigade, and they were able to drive the Union forces from the field. Jackson was unable to shatter Banks' corps, but the very presence of Jackson's troops made the Union nervous. Having once again been given the initiative, Robert E. Lee would not waste it. Lee needed to smash Pope's army before it was joined by the Army of the Potomac. And on August 25th, Lee sent Jackson on a wide movement around Pope's west flank to strike in the rear of Pope's forces. Jackson's infantry was referred to as foot cavalry, for they moved faster on foot than most believed possible. Jackson used his knowledge of the terrain to find unexpected routes to and around the enemy, and he had the ability to inspire his men to endure long, hard marches. Confederate Major General W.B. Tolliver described Stonewall Jackson's raid around Pope.
Stonewall Jackson, with Ewell's and A.P. Hill's divisions and his old division under my command, marched northward to cut Pope's communications and destroy his supplies. Quartermasters and commissaries were left behind. 3 days' meager rations had been cooked and stowed away in our haversacks and pockets, and tin cans and an occasional frying pan constituted the entire camp equipage.
Jackson kept their destination known only to a few to ensure secrecy.
This extreme reticence was very uncomfortable and annoying to his subordinate commanders, and was sometimes carried too far, but it was the real secret of the reputation for ubiquity which he had acquired, and which was so well expressed by General McClellan in one of his dispatches. "I am afraid of Jackson. He will turn up where least expected."
Jackson marched his resupplied men through the night toward the field where the South had earned its first great victory, Manassas, near Bull Run Creek. The Battle of Second Manassas, or Second Bull Run, began on August 28th near the Bronner family farm. After their long night march, Jackson and most of his men were catching a few precious moments of sleep. Then, a captured Union message was brought to Jackson, indicating that Pope intended to concentrate his forces at Manassas Junction. Tolliver writes,
The captured dispatch aroused Jackson like an electric shock. He was essentially a man of action. He rarely, if ever, hesitated. He never asked advice. He did not seem to reflect or reason out of purpose, but he leapt by instinct to a conclusion, and then as rapidly undertook its execution.
In this fight, there was no maneuvering and very little tactics. It was a question of endurance, and both endured. Jackson did not achieve a decisive victory, with both sides taking heavy casualties. But he did succeed in getting General Pope's attention. Pope had been looking for Jackson, fearful of where and when he might crop up. And now he'd found him. But he misread the situation. He believed that Jackson had been in retreat when the forces clashed. Pope knew that Longstreet was coming to reinforce Jackson, but he thought that now he had caught Jackson before those reinforcements could arrive. The next day, August 29th, Pope threw his forces at Jackson, who had entrenched along an unfinished railroad grade. Pope had the numerically superior force, but Jackson's defenses were strong. Again, casualties were high, but the Confederates pushed the Union forces back time and time again. Around noon on that day, Longstreet's force arrived, marching out of Thoroughfare Gap to take position on Jackson's right. Pope ordered Major General Fitz-John Porter to attack, but Porter, seeing that he would be overwhelmed by Longstreet's force, held firm. The next day, August 30th, Pope again ordered Porter's 5th Corps to attack. He seemed oblivious to the fact that Longstreet's arrival eliminated the Union's advantage in men. Pope didn't realize it, but he was playing into Robert E. Lee's hands. Pope kept expecting the Confederates to retreat, but Lee was hoping to be attacked. Confederate artillery tore apart the attack by Porter's 5th Corps, and then Longstreet's 25,000 infantry crushed the Union left flank. It was not the rout of 1st Manassas, with terrified Union troops fleeing the field in complete disorder, but it was another embarrassing Union defeat. Pope was removed by Abraham Lincoln and sent back west on September 16th. Faced with his broken and disorganized army, Lincoln now turned, no doubt reluctantly, to the man who had rebuilt the Army of the Potomac after the first loss at Bull Run, General George McClellan. McClellan would get one more chance to create a highly trained professional army and prove that he could then lead the army to victory against the Confederacy's greatest general. For in the wake of another stunning victory at Manassas, Virginia, Robert E. Lee was turning north.